Thank you, Jody, and thank you so much to this great opportunity today. I really feel privileged and blessed to be here. And it's always a little bit daunting following genius. And so we'll see how we do today. But I just want to say thank you to our speakers previously and to Joe Rutten, whose passion and the work of the Catholic business fraternity clearly has paid incredible dividends for South Dakota, for this region, and for the Catholics and Christians across our communities. I'm going to change this out here just slightly. Okay. I'm going to start, Frank and Michael both talked about getting a little earthy, and my first story is going to get earthy really quick, so bear with me here. But as Jody mentioned, my husband Ken and I have the privilege of being parents to 8 children. And when you are the parents to 8 children, I'll tell you now, their ages 9 to 22, they have a way of keeping you very humbled and occasionally quite crazy. And so it wasn't long ago this summer after arriving back home, and our kids are active, probably like many of yours, and we're kind of collecting ourselves because we have 8 soccer players. And so we watched something like 22 games of soccer. Okay, we're all hauling ourselves back in the 15-passenger van, which I'm the only college president in America that drives one of those, and we're unpacking it. And if I could, I'd own stock in Yankee Candle because there's really nothing that can deal with the level of scent from 6 boys and 2 girls who've just played a whole weekend of soccer. So we get back in the car, and we're coming home, and as we do, everyone's getting a quick bite to eat, and then we're kind of collecting ourselves on Sunday evening. And my junior says to me, Mom, I got to just ask you a couple questions. He's working in some political lobbying efforts this summer, and so we began this discussion about political lobbying, and I'm quickly interrupted by my sophomore who says, Mom, tomorrow I have to deal with that conflict at work, and I just need to run this by you. Tell me what your thoughts are. And then I look at my husband and I say, we got to get that laundry into the washer right now because I'm not sure I can handle the stench in this house at the moment. And simultaneously, Luke is calling and he says to us, hey, Mom and Dad, did I tell you that I signed you up for one of the meals that you're going to host for our football team? And so we got a bunch of guys coming over tomorrow night. I don't know if I reminded you of that, but I signed you up about a month ago to do that. And I'm like, oh, okay. So throughout the rest of the evening, as we do, we tried to just kind of regroup as a family. And then Ken and I go down and we lay down in bed and we sort of have a little bit of a prayer ritual that we share together. And so we are offering prayers. And then after we offer prayers, we sort of do this laundry list of things coming up for the week ahead. So I said, kids have dental appointments. It's just about before, as we go back to school, and we got to get the brakes on our van fixed. I could tell they were squealing at a rate that needed serious attention. Simela, our daughter, had physical therapy appointments. We were going to go do totus tuus meals, and Elijah and Peter, our other 2 sons, had play practice, and Ken, my delightful husband, had agreed to help coach the British accents. And I'm like, what? He said, yeah, I know. They needed someone to help do that, and Ken has many, many gifts, one of which is doing an accent in any language possible, and he had agreed to volunteer. And so I'm like, okay, Ken, let's just go to sleep so that we can cope with what's happening this week. So we roll over and we go to bed, and it's about midnight that I get this tap on my shoulder. And those of you who are moms and dads or grandparents, you sort of know what I'm talking about. And I turned to see my 9-year-old Zachariah wrapped in his blanket and saying, Mom, I got a problem. I said, Zachariah, it's past midnight. Is it really urgent? He's like, yeah. This is where it gets earthy. My poop is purple. And so I wiped and wiped. And now I think the toilet has backed up, and really it's a fountain. And I'm very logical, and my husband's highly creative, and I say to him, You ate beets for dinner, son. We know that beets turn your poop purple. You're going to be okay. He goes, Mom, there's a fountain. My husband is already halfway down the stairs addressing the major backup that's happening in the boys' bathroom downstairs. And yeah, it was 1:30 a.m. before we went to bed, and I just looked at Ken and said, so much for that good night's rest. That sleep's going to be pretty much forgotten. And we all have these moments, right? The call from the school nurse, the call from the nursing home, the coworker who needs some help uncovering a project because she has an ailing parent. The call from the child who said, hey, I need black pants before that performance tonight. The neighbor who locked her keys in the car and needs a quick ride somewhere. The son or daughter who calls and just needs a moment to talk. Our lives are constantly disrupted. And this could be annoying and even at times despairing if we didn't see a divine purpose behind all the disruptions. Which is to say, perhaps there's a silver lining to the midnight wake-up calls, or the random visits to our office at work, or the puzzling proposition from a partner company. You see, in the entrepreneurial world, we frequently talk about disruptive innovation. The ideas that become products and services or concepts that force us into new ways of doing business, new ways of seeing the world, new ways of interacting with our customers. And giving time to disruption just doesn't sound nice. It doesn't sound like anything we would ever want to choose to do. And yet the entrepreneurial world, and I would argue our life as people of faith, invites us to embrace disruption every day. To be disrupted by Christ is to live a life of purpose. Let me say it again. To be disrupted or even inconvenienced by Christ is to lead a life of purpose. We often think that to be disrupted is to be thrown off course, to have our purpose suddenly obscured or detoured. And that's true, because often we think we know where we need to go, and yet quite often God has another plan. And one of my favorite stories on this, we think we know where we're going theme, actually comes from the famous spiritual writer Henry Nouwen. And Nouwen relays a conversation he had with a longtime friend and fellow colleague at another university. His friend is an academic professor, and he said, you know, Henry, my whole life I thought I would write the perfect book, the piece of scholarship that would gain me respect and fame. I would work on it through the years, I would refine it, but I was constantly disrupted by students who needed explanations on this or that, or by the student who came in to ask for a letter of recommendation, or the student who stopped by to ask a question about a relationship issue, or about a career direction. And now, as that man nears retirement, he said, I look through this pile of letters and Christmas cards and photos from their children, and I came to this conclusion. I always thought my book was going to be my great work, he said. But what I realized is that the disruptions were my best work. How much more wise would we all be if we realized that when people need us, whether it was a coworker who needs us to talk, a child at our pant leg for food, a request from a volunteer in our community to help out on a particular project, an elderly mother who's quietly suggests for us to call her sometime, if we could see that these disruptions are actually God tugging at our hearts, requesting our hands to serve, suggesting we make some time to talk. And this is not the random act of kindness that Michael's talking about. This is relationship building. How much better could we make our lives and the lives of others if we, without 20/20 hindsight, could see with confidence that what has seemingly distracted us from our work is actually God's will? In 2003, my husband Ken and I were living in Germany. Ken was in the U.S. military, serving as a speechwriter, the chief speechwriter for the U.S. Air Force headquarters in Europe. At 31, he was a rising star in the U.S. military. He was Teacher of the Year at the U.S. Air Force Academy with an undergraduate degree in aerospace engineering. He had a background in sophisticated project management and had a newly minted PhD in English. He was headed on a fast track to promotion and recognized for the incredibly diverse skill set he possessed. It was the day after his 31st birthday, however, that we were sitting in a Catholic church in Kaiserslautern, Germany, that my husband, of 31, suddenly lost his ability to speak coherently. He developed a series of strong tremors and myoclonic jerks that flipped him out of the pew. I turned to him with 6 children in tow and thought, my goodness, he's having a stroke. I need to get him to the ER. And we quickly realized he was completely incapacitated on the right side of his body. And so we required assistance to get him to the emergency room. After a series of tests, they ruled out a heart attack or stroke, but they quickly realized his condition was deteriorating and he needed the attention of experts. For a man whose life revolved around language and words, crafting the U.S. message to its allies in Europe and at NATO, he was suddenly profoundly stuttering, had loss of short-term memory, impaired cognitive and physiological function. Our lives were clearly in disruption. 2 months of intensive treatments to try and reawaken parts of his brain failed, and he was medically sent back to the U.S., where he underwent 3 more months of intensive treatments at top neurological facilities here in America. And by November of that year, a medical board of the U.S. Air Force ruled him unfit for continued duty, and he was honorably discharged. Our lives were quickly disrupted. I showed up on my parents' door after being out of the house for about 14 years with 6 children in tow. I was back in South Dakota and began to look for opportunities to regroup our life. I found a 3/4-time position as a grant writer for $24,000 a year at Dakota Wesleyan. My goal was merely to reconnect to my network in the U.S. and to find a more robust position. But I stepped into higher education, and I had a new calling. And 10 years later, I was invited to be their president. While our life has met with continual ups and downs, and Ken's condition has gravitated from very severe to reasonably okay, we've had children who have struggled immensely for their lives. In all of this, we have realized the presence of God's will and His grace at work. There's nothing like not having a father who can do a whole lot of things that suddenly you realize the grace of God is working through your children who pick up the responsibilities, who help Him, who help themselves, who help each other. And so, as many of you have experienced these sort of inexplicable events, you realize there's a lot that's not in your control. Frankly, most of everything is not in your control. And what you do have to lean on is God and the presence of God in the relationships that you have invested in and built. For the fundamental principle of understanding and appreciating disruption is trust. Whether we're a CEO of a major corporation or a new hire working to solve a problem at the grassroots level of an organization, we're only as good as the team that surrounds us. We have to trust others. We have to trust that God's talents are at work through those around us. And we have to trust in a plan for which we can often not see the end point. Now, I grew up in an entrepreneurial family. We lost money, we gained money. We started businesses, we sold businesses. And rarely Was anything that happened ever the exact master plan? Most of the time, opportunities emerged, new problems needed to be solved, and by creating a work environment, whether it was in our family business or in our home, that was built on trust and faith, we became far more agile, far more adaptable, and prepared to confront whatever disruption lie ahead. When God is at the wellspring of our soul, when we understand that our talents are God-gifted, we operate with far less fear and far more courage. And I draw inspiration for handling disruption from the Acts of the Apostles. This is where I think in our Bible, the rubber hits the road. This is where disruption takes a front and center position. And frankly, it's where disruption gave birth to our church. In chapter 10 of Acts, there's a wonderful story of Peter trying to figure out this kind of new evangelical role he has. What does it mean to be a disciple? And Cornelius has sent his slaves to Joppa to track down Peter. And for all practical purposes, I think Peter's kind of scared. So he's doing what a scared disciple, or maybe what scared and any of us might be doing at this juncture. After God has said, go out, do all these things, you're equipped to do it. And he's like, really? I'm not sure I have all the tools in my toolbox. So Peter's kind of hanging out. I think he's hiding. He's actually on the roof praying. He gets hungry, and he has a vision. In this vision, he sees the clouds of heaven open up and a large sheet being lowered to the ground with all sorts of animals, birds and reptiles. And Peter hears the voice of God saying, slaughter these animals and eat. Whoa, this is radical. Peter's at a crossroads. He has a confusing moment. Why? Because God just told him to take and eat everything. Now, in our world today, that might not mean anything. But this is a little bit incongruent with the Jewish norms. So Peter sort of says, hold on, God. I don't eat anything that's unclean or profane. We don't do that. Remember, I'm a Jew. I just don't start slaughtering and eating. Now, this is not the first time in the Bible or in the Gospels or in Acts that Jesus has challenged tradition. Jesus likes to disrupt our normal routine. Think about the story of the Samaritan woman at the well in John chapter 4. We have this moment when the Samaritan woman is asked by Jesus for a drink. And the Samaritan woman replies, how can you, a Jew, ask me, a Samaritan, and a woman for a drink? That's really outside of the norm. And then we have the story of the centurion's request for the healing of his beloved dying slave in Luke chapter 7. And the centurion says, but I'm not worthy to have you under my roof, Jesus. And Jesus walks in and heals the man. Disruption of the norms again. And in one of my favorite passages, and I always talk to my boys about this, I say to them, let's listen to chapter 10 of Luke's gospel. Jesus is giving direction to his disciples. This is when he's sending them out. I think of this as a pregame pep talk. He says this, carry no money bag, shake the dust off your feet. And then he gives them this additional practical advice. Stay in the same house and eat and drink whatever is offered to you. I imagine the disciples kind of huddled around. They shake their heads. They're thinking, did he just say what I heard him say? Did he say stay in the house of a Gentile? Did he say take no money with you? Did he say eat anything they serve you? So here Peter is several years later getting the message again in Acts. Slaughter and eat the four-legged creatures, the birds of the air, the reptiles, and the fish of the sea. And Peter, a faithful Jew, replies, certainly not, God, for I have never eaten anything profane and unclean. And then God challenges Peter. And God says, what I have made clean, you are not to call profane. This is not a story merely about food. This passage and the subsequent lessons of this chapter in the book of Acts is a critical turning point in Christianity. Why? Because this passage is really about how God is calling us to be disrupted in our relationships, both with Him and with each other. This is a pivotal moment of transformation, not just for the Galilean fisherman turned preacher, but for the entire body of people that this first pope, Peter, would lead. And how does it happen? By God telling Peter, Peter, you don't have the full picture yet. You may have thought you did, but allow me to let you see the world from where I'm standing. God is telling us, Peter, I'm going to relocate you to a place where you have my eyes and my heart. He says to Peter, I'm going to disrupt your confidence with new truths. In our business language, we might say, I'm going to disrupt your leadership style with a new team. I'm going to disrupt what you think your mission statement is with my mission statement. And one more thing, Peter, this is the highly entrepreneurial part, you're going to have to deal with it. That was the marching orders from our master. And friends, this disrupted everything they probably ever knew. And then we have the moment at the end of chapter 10, between verses 28 and 34, where Peter says, I get it. I truly understand what you mean. God shows no partiality. To use Frank's words, God wants unity and community. He wants relationship and communion. Frank said, the constituent element of our lives is found through relationship. That's what God's telling us. It's not about separating everyone and everything. It's about finding community with one another. And if we can read Scripture with this honest appraisal, we can note one thing. God loves disruption, and it's through disruption that we begin to know each other more wholly, more fully, and in communion. Without disruption, we become comfortable. We think we know it all. Disruption forces us to recognize we are not always in control. Without embracing disruption, we stay in routine. We continue to do the same thing over and over. We associate with the same type of people over and over. We fear reaching out to those who might think differently, believe different things, act in different ways, without stopping to consider how we might benefit from that disruption. The passages in both the Gospel of Luke and in the Acts of the Apostles are helping us to understand that we are all family. And as family, we have an obligation to be the hands and feet of Christ to each other in communion, in relationship, as one Catholic community and church, regardless of our background or our beliefs. Jesus reminds us, as he did his disciples, we're not about making negative comments about our peers at work, even though sometimes we're just trying not to, but we do it anyway. We're not about separating the sheep from the goats in our political discussions, or about judging the sinner from the saint. We're not about separating the ignorant from the wise, or the citizen from the illegal immigrant, or the incarcerated from the free. Our gospel message is not about separating. Instead, it's about finding community by embracing each other in full and meaningful ways as sisters and brothers of Christ, cognizant that we are all different, that we are all gifted with distinct talents, all called to different forms of mission and ministry. If we, like Peter, think we have the full picture, Jesus offers us a stark reminder that our work is not merely to judge, but to open ourselves and to use our talents to get the will of God done. John Wesley, I'm at a Methodist institution, so occasionally I got to pull him in. Remarked, the way we do the will of God is we do all the good we can, cognizant of the messages that came before us, by all the means we can, in all the ways we can, in all the places we can, at all the times we can, to all the people we can, as long as ever you can. At Dakota Wesleyan, we strive to embed this commitment to disruption in everything we do. It's evidenced by our intentional commitment, and many Catholic colleges do this, to help students discern their calling. We don't shy away from talking about the fact that you have a vocational calling. God has gifted you with a distinct set of gifts and talents. And we want to help you figure out what that is. So we ask questions, we listen, we mentor, and we support students as they discern what God is calling them to do, because that's how they create value. Disruption is also evidenced by our passionate commitment to serve all students, but notably to serve first-generation and low-income college students. Outside our tribal colleges, we serve one of the highest percentages of first-generation and low-income students. Because Mark Long is here as president of Mount Marty, I'm going to say he does too. Okay, so we're in good hands. That's what private higher education is doing in this state, okay? We're serving first-generation low-income students. And where elite schools build billion-dollar endowments and educate a mere 5 to 7% of the low-income population in this country, we have a different and disrupted mission. You see, our belief is that the best way out of poverty is often through education. And the best way off welfare is also through education. So we make access and affordability of higher education a priority. And last year, over 50% of our students fell into that category. And we graduated low-income first-generation students in the top 10% of schools in the country. That's our commitment to working entrepreneurially to give people an opportunity to improve their lives through education. Disruption is also evidenced in our curriculum. We do have an entrepreneurial spirit at Dakota Wesleyan. It's in our ethos. And so every freshman student takes a course in innovation, problem solving, and creativity. And last year, well over 150 of them started their own business as freshmen. They understand there's a problem, they ideate on possible solutions, they develop innovative products, and they take them to market. And it's all a low-cost operation. But they're all learning the critical practices of successful entrepreneurs, and we tell them on the first day they're going to fail, and that's good. And I had one student say to me, I've never been to a university that wants me to fail. I said, it's a new day. We do. There's critical learning that happens when you fail. There's critical learning that happens when you don't have all the pieces of the puzzle and it's not gifted to you, right? That's key. That's disruption. And that's part of what we've done in our curriculum. And finally, I would just say disruption is evident in our commitment to developing a worship community in which people come together in small groups, much like they did in the early church, to ask deep questions of what their faith means to them, even though they're coming from a variety of different backgrounds, but coming into community to understand who God is in their life. And in many cases, with our young people today, they declare themselves nuns. There is no relationship with anyone. And we're inviting them unapologetically to have a conversation. God is seeking community for us, and when we live a life of faith, we must go outside of our comfort zone. We must be thrown into confusion, and we must learn to trust. And we must trust that God is outside our comfort zone with us. In our workplace, this manifests itself in different ways. We can ask critical questions. How do we steward our profits? How do we model patience with our coworkers? How do we invite people to Christ? How do we take a moment of silence or prayer in our workplaces and simply call upon the wisdom of the room to guide our decision-making? How do we exhibit calm amid the entrepreneurial storm? When we are people of faith, rooted in faith, that calm pervades our decision-making. It guides us. And sometimes this work is intimidating, and sometimes, frankly, it's scary. But if we're rooted in the right purpose, if we're rooted in the right mission, it becomes an act of courage. We can live our whole life trying to minimize our disruptions or simply ignoring them. We can live our life associating with all the same type of people, or we can step outside our comfort zone as Peter did. And when he realized in Acts 10, verse 28, that God has shown me that I should not call any person profane or unclean. And when this happened, friends, the family of God grew in ways beyond what any human could expect. Peter's trust of God's sanctity for all humankind launched the mission to fulfill Jesus' final words, to go and make disciples of all people, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. God's greatest blessing to Ken and myself was his disruption. It was the disruption in the form of 8 children. I can tell you at age 22, I did not think I was going to have 8 children. You would have said that was crazy. Okay? But that was a good disruption. The disruption of his own illness has graced our family in powerful and profound ways. We understand as a family, as a couple, and even in our Wesleyan community, we don't live in control. We live in a constant state of disruption. And in this way, we have come to trust that God's plan is greater than anything we can fully understand. And we remain committed to a yet unrevealed, bigger picture that helps us to understand the problems we encounter or the unexpected blessings we experience. I appreciate, believe me, I appreciate that living a disrupted life can be exhausting. It is not easy. It is not easy to always pay attention to the disruptions. But there is a quote that has inspired me when I consider my life in the tempest of disruption. And it comes from a woman of little popularity. Her name is Raissa Maritain. You might recognize her husband, Jacques Maritain, because he was a world-renowned and celebrated Christian philosopher. I mention this because her husband was a neo-Thomist. That's a Christian philosopher in the tradition of the scholastics of Thomas Aquinas. And such a theology, as they highlighted, both Frank and Michael highlighted, is well-ordered, it's logical, it has everything in its place. And there's a great deal of insight and wisdom that we've gained from Thomas Aquinas and the neo-scholastics. But such a theology and philosophy that has these precise outlines and argumentation is not often completely compatible with our lives. Raissa was a poet, and her view on life, I believe, affirms what we have examined today, a life of divine disruption. And she said this, "I have a feeling that what is asked of us is to live in the whirlwind without keeping back any of our substance, without keeping back anything for ourselves, neither rest, nor health, nor leisure, but to pray incessantly. In fact, to let ourselves pitch and toss in the waves of the divine until the day when it will say, 'That is enough.'" The divine disruption is the blessing of all of our lives. So friends, I'd ask you to join me in a closing prayer. May each of us throw ourselves confidently into the arms of God's embrace, knowing as God has told us that the wind blows where it wills, and that in the wind of disruption, may we open ourselves to becoming Spirit-filled leaders, embracing our call to boldly reach out to our neighbors so that they too may come to know Christ through our actions and our words. And may we, as servant leaders, live lives of disruption, lives disrupted by Christ each and every day of our week, Sunday through Monday. Amen.